The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an oppressive, sterile sound that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. 4-year-old Emma sat rigidly in the oversized witness chair, her tiny body absolutely dwarfed by the legal apparatus surrounding her. Her small feet dangled helplessly above the cold marble floor, swinging back and forth in a nervous rhythm that she couldn't control. The chair itself seemed designed to intimidate. Hard wood, no cushioning, nothing soft or comforting for a traumatized child forced into an adult world that had become her personal nightmare. The courtroom was massive, cathedral-like in its proportions. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, making Emma feel even smaller than her actual size. Mahogany walls lined the space, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. The judge's bench loomed above her like a throne of judgment, literally elevated so that the judge could look down upon everyone beneath him. Judge Harrison Montgomery was exactly that type of judge, stern, uncompromising, a man who had spent 43 years in law believing that the truth could be extracted through formal procedure and authoritative questioning. He had no children of his own. He had never dealt with childhood trauma. He had no experience with selective mutism. He only knew law. His eyes bore down at her now with an expression that Emma could only interpret as anger. His face was weathered, lined with the weight of thousands of cases, but right now it looked like a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon. His gray eyebrows furrowed together in a deep V of disapproval. Emma's small body trembled uncontrollably, her hands gripping the edge of the witness chair so tightly that her tiny knuckles turned white. She could feel the pressure of everyone's stare, the lawyers, the court officers, the reporters scribbling notes, the gallery observers who had come to witness this custody battle. All of their eyes were on her. All of them were waiting. "Emma," the judge said sharply, his voice echoing through the cavernous courtroom like thunder, "you must tell this court which parent you love more." The words landed like a physical blow. The question itself was impossible, not just difficult, but fundamentally impossible for a child to answer. It wasn't a question designed for a 4-year-old mind. It was a question that demanded she choose between two people she loved equally, two people whose love for her had become weaponized in a devastating legal war. The judge's tone was firm, almost accusatory, as if Emma's inability to speak was a personal affront to his authority, as if she was deliberately being difficult or stubborn. Her throat closed immediately. It wasn't a conscious decision. Her body was responding to trauma beyond her control. The selective mutism that had plagued her for 3 agonizing months had its roots in something deeper than shyness or typical childhood anxiety. It was a symptom of severe psychological distress, a manifestation of her mind's attempt to protect itself from an unbearable situation. In the gallery, her mother, Sarah Mitchell, sat with her shoulders hunched forward, her entire frame trembling with barely contained sobs. Tears streamed silently down her face, leaving dark tracks on her carefully applied makeup. She clutched a tissue in her hand, twisting it into a rope. Sarah had loved Emma with a fierce, protective intensity since the moment she was born. She had been an involved mother, attentive and nurturing. But the breakup with Emma's father had transformed her from a woman of grace and patience into someone desperate and fighting for survival. She worried constantly that she would lose custody of her only child. The thought consumed her every waking moment. Across the courtroom, Emma's father, Robert Jackson, looked like he was ready to explode. His jaw was clenched so tightly that veins bulged along the sides of his neck. His fists were balled at his sides, and his attorney had to place a restraining hand on his shoulder to keep him seated. Robert had been the more relaxed parent before the breakup, the one who taught Emma to laugh and be silly. But the custody battle had transformed him into someone angry and vindictive. He believed Sarah had turned Emma against him. He believed the legal system was unfair. He believed everything was a fight to be won, and he would go to any lengths to win his daughter in this battle. Neither parent seemed to realize that they were already losing, not the custody case, but their daughter. They were losing Emma to silence, to fear, to the devastating psychological damage that their war was inflicting on her fragile developing mind. Emma's therapist, Dr. Williams, sat in the gallery and watched with growing alarm. She had been working with Emma for 6 weeks, trying to help her process the trauma of her parents' separation and the custody battle. The selective mutism had developed gradually, starting with refusal to speak to her father after a particularly heated argument between the parents. Then it had spread to her teachers, then to her best friend, Maya, whom she had loved playing with until recently, then to her therapist. Now she had constructed a wall of silence so complete that she hadn't spoken a single word to anyone in 92 days. Dr. Williams had warned the attorneys that forcing Emma to testify could cause severe, long-term psychological damage. She had written letters to the court, but the judge had overruled her concerns. "The child must testify," Judge Montgomery had declared. "The truth is paramount, and the child is the only one who knows where she truly belongs." The pressure in the courtroom was suffocating. Emma could feel it like a physical weight pressing down on her small chest. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her heart was racing so fast she thought it might explode. She wanted desperately to speak, to tell someone, anyone, that this was wrong. She wanted to scream that she loved both her parents. She wanted to beg them to stop fighting. She wanted to explain that choosing between them felt like being asked to cut herself in half. But the words were trapped inside her throat, like prisoners behind an impenetrable wall. The judge's expression hardened. He leaned forward, gripping the edges of his bench. "Emma," he said again, his voice even sharper than before, "I am asking you a direct question. The court requires an answer. Which parent do you love more?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and suffocating. The court reporter's fingers froze above her stenotype machine. The attorneys stopped their whispering. Even the bailiff straightened in his chair, sensing the critical nature of this moment. This was it, the moment that would determine Emma's future. The moment that would decide where she would live, who would have custody, how her life would be divided between two people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Emma's small mouth opened. Her lips trembled. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting for words that might never come. And in that moment of absolute silence, watching a 4-year-old child struggle against an impossible choice, nobody in that courtroom, except perhaps Dr. Williams, understood the depth of the damage already being inflicted. Nobody realized that this moment would become the catalyst for something completely unexpected. Nobody could predict that in just moments, a force would enter this courtroom that would change everything. The pressure was suffocating. The silence was deafening. Something had to give. Something would give. And it would happen in the most unexpected way imaginable. The silence in the courtroom had become unbearable. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing down on everyone present like a physical force. Emma's mouth remained frozen open, her lips trembling slightly, but no sound emerged. The seconds ticked by, 5, 10, 15 seconds, an eternity in courtroom time. Judge Montgomery's face was turning an alarming shade of crimson, the veins in his temple pulsing with visible frustration. He was not accustomed to being disobeyed, and he clearly saw Emma's silence as defiance rather than disability. "Emma," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I am giving you one more opportunity to answer this court's question. Which parent do you love more?" The second asking of the question was worse than the first. It carried an implicit threat. It communicated to Emma that her inability to speak was somehow disappointing, that she was failing a test that mattered enormously. Her small body began to shake more violently. Her hands, which had been gripping the witness chair, suddenly went limp. Tears started streaming down her face, not the quiet tears of sadness, but the desperate, gasping tears of a child in genuine psychological distress. Her mother stood up in the gallery, unable to contain herself any longer. "This is cruel," Sarah cried out. "She's only 4 years old. You're traumatizing her." "Madam," the judge snapped, pointing his gavel towards Sarah like a weapon. You will sit down immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom and held in contempt." The bailiff moved toward Sarah, his hand hovering near her elbow. She sat down reluctantly, her face streaked with tears, her entire body radiating helpless rage at the injustice unfolding before her eyes. Emma flinched at the confrontation between her mother and the judge, her anxiety spiking even higher. This was exactly what she feared, her attempt to navigate between her parents causing conflict, tension, danger. Judge Montgomery turned his attention back to Emma, preparing to make some kind of official pronouncement about her refusal to testify, when something unprecedented happened. Something that would later be described by courtroom observers as either miraculous or impossibly well-timed, depending on their perspective. The heavy wooden courtroom doors, the kind that open inward with substantial weight and authority, suddenly burst open with shocking force. The sound was explosive, like a gunshot echoing through the marble chamber. Everyone in the courtroom jumped. The court reporters gasped. The judge's gavel flew from his hand and clattered across his bench. Gasps rippled through the gallery like a wave. A uniformed police officer strode through the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-50s, with a weathered face that suggested decades of service. His uniform was immaculate, crisp blue shirt, pressed slacks, polished boots that clicked against the marble floor with authoritative precision. The badge on his chest gleamed. The gun at his hip was visible. Everything about him screamed official authority, which in that moment of chaos somehow made him unthreatening rather than intimidating. But it wasn't the officer that made the entire courtroom freeze in astonishment. It was or rather, who walked beside him. Behind the officer came a dog. Not a small dog, not a typical courtroom-appropriate dog. A massive, absolutely magnificent golden retriever, easily 90 pounds of pure golden majesty. The dog's coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights like liquid sunlight, each hair catching and reflecting the light in a way that seemed almost supernatural. The fur was perfectly groomed, lustrous and beautiful. But it was the dog's presence itself that commanded attention. The way he moved, with perfect and dignity, his massive head held high, his gait composed and purposeful. Around the dog's chest and back was a professionally designed vest, the official K9 vest, emblazoned with badges and official insignia indicating this was not a pet, but a working animal with certification and credentials. The vest was navy blue with gold threading, and it conveyed legitimate authority. The courtroom erupted into shocked murmurs and exclamations. Nobody had authorized this. Nobody had expected this. The opposing counsel attorney shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation at this unauthorized interruption. Reporters who had been quietly observing in the back began frantically texting, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Judge Montgomery's gavel, which he had scrambled to retrieve, slammed down with furious force, once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the courtroom like cannon fire. "Officer," he thundered, his voice shaking with rage. "What is the meaning of this interruption? This is an official court proceeding. You cannot simply burst into my courtroom with an animal. Remove that dog immediately, or I will have you arrested for contempt of court." The officer remained calm, completely unbothered by the judge's fury. He stood in the center of the courtroom, his hand resting gently on the dog's head, his expression serene and professional. The dog, whose name was Buddy, though nobody in the courtroom knew it yet, sat perfectly still, his brown eyes scanning the courtroom with intelligent awareness. "Your Honor," the officer said, his voice steady and professional, completely immune to the judge's rage. "I understand your concern. This interruption is unexpected, and I apologize for that. However, I am here with proper authorization and documentation. This is Buddy, a certified courthouse therapy dog. He is registered with the state of Pennsylvania as an official emotional support and trauma response animal. I have authorization papers from the courthouse administration office, signed by the deputy director herself, permitting his presence in courtrooms handling sensitive cases involving minors. The officer pulled out official-looking documents from his jacket pocket, holding them forward as evidence. Furthermore, Your Honor, I received an emergency call from Dr. Williams, the licensed therapist assigned to this case, indicating that the minor witness is in acute psychological distress and at risk of severe emotional trauma. Dr. Williams requested that a certified therapy animal be brought to this courtroom immediately. The courthouse administration approved this request. I have followed all proper legal channels. The opposing counsel attorney was already objecting vociferously, waving his arms dramatically. This is highly irregular. This is an attempt to manipulate the witness. This is exactly the kind of interference that compromises legal proceedings, the integrity of this testimony. But his words seemed to fade into irrelevance, because something extraordinary was happening in the courtroom, something that transcended legal arguments and procedural objections. Emma's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress, had suddenly opened. Her tear-stained face was now focused on something, or rather someone, the dog. Buddy's massive golden form stood silently in the center of the courtroom, and his intelligent brown eyes had somehow found Emma's gaze across the distance. For the first time in 3 months, Emma's rigid expression shifted. A spark of something, curiosity perhaps, or wonder, or maybe just a moment of distraction from her overwhelming fear, flickered across her face. The judge was still objecting, still demanding that the officer remove the dog, still wielding his authority and threatening legal consequences. But his words seemed to be happening in a distant part of the universe. The energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Buddy's tail moved slightly, not a full wag, but a subtle movement that suggested peaceful, non-threatening acceptance. Emma's trembling reduced just barely, just imperceptibly, but noticeably. The judge's rage was meeting an immovable object, a child beginning to respond to something other than fear for the first time in months, and nobody in that courtroom, except perhaps Dr. Williams, who was watching with professional interest, understood what was about to happen next. What they didn't realize was that they were witnessing the exact moment when everything would change, when a child's silence would begin its journey toward healing, when a dog's simple presence would accomplish what no amount of legal procedure or judicial authority ever could. Judge Montgomery prepared to make an official pronouncement, his gavel raised in fury when he paused. His eyes, still angry but now curious, watched Emma's face. He saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen before, the first glimmer of a child responding to something beyond fear. And in that moment, something shifted in him as well. The moment stretched like taffy, infinite and suspended, as Judge Montgomery held his gavel midair, his eyes locked on Emma's transformed expression. The anger that had been radiating from him just seconds before seemed to evaporate, replaced by something more complex, confusion perhaps, mixed with a dawning awareness that his judicial authority was colliding with something far more powerful than courtroom procedure. His hand, which had been raised to deliver some kind of official pronouncement, slowly lowered. Buddy's golden fur gleamed under the relentless fluorescent lights, each individual hair catching and reflecting the illumination in a way that seemed almost ethereal. The dog's coat was immaculate, well-groomed and lustrous, suggesting that he was cared for with genuine love and attention. But more than his physical beauty, it was the dog's absolute serenity that dominated the courtroom. He stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating calm, his intelligent brown eyes moving slowly across the courtroom with the measured awareness of someone, or in this case, something, who understood the gravity of the moment. The officer, whose nameplate read Officer James Mitchell, a cruel coincidence of nomenclature shared with Emma's mother Sarah Mitchell, remained perfectly composed. He didn't rush the judge. He didn't push his case further. He simply stood with his hand resting gently on Buddy's head, giving the animal space to work his quiet magic. As Buddy's golden eyes swept across the courtroom and finally came to rest on Emma, something unmistakable happened. The dog's massive head tilted slightly, just barely perceptible toward the traumatized child. It was a gesture of recognition, of acknowledgement, of non-threatening peaceful intention. The movement was so subtle, so perfectly calibrated, that it spoke volumes about the extensive training this animal had. This was not a random pet. This was a professional, as certified and credentialed as any human expert in that courtroom. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, the characteristic pattern of a child in acute anxiety, began to shift. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, her breathing deepened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in protective tension, dropped slightly. Her tiny hands, which had been gripping the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, loosened their grip. The opposing counsel attorney was still standing, still objecting, his voice rising to fill the silence. "Your Honor, I must formally object to the presence of this animal in the courtroom. This is a clear attempt to emotionally manipulate the witness and compromise the integrity of her testimony. The defense is using theatrical tactics to—" "Sit down," Judge Montgomery said quietly. The attorney stopped mid-sentence, shocked. The judge hadn't shouted. He hadn't banged his gavel. He had simply spoken 4 words in a tone that carried absolute authority. The attorney immediately sat down, recognizing that the judge's authority had shifted in some fundamental way. Judge Montgomery rose slowly from his elevated bench. He was a tall man, probably 6'2", with the bearing of someone who had spent decades wielding power and authority. But as he descended the steps from his bench, the same bench that had made him loom so imposingly over Emma just moments before, his expression was changing. The stern mask of judicial authority was slipping away, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. He walked slowly across the courtroom, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Every eye in the room followed him. He approached Buddy cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The dog remained perfectly still, watching the judge with those intelligent brown eyes. When Judge Montgomery reached out his hand to touch Buddy's head, the dog's tail wagged once, slowly, with the same deliberate intentionality that had characterized his every movement. "How long has he been trained?" the judge asked Officer Mitchell, his voice soft and genuinely curious. 18 months, Your Honor," the officer replied. He was trained specifically for courtroom and emergency response situations involving traumatized children. He has an 18-month certification process that includes behavioral conditioning, trauma response training, and ongoing professional development. He's one of the most well-trained therapy animals in the state. Judge Montgomery nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Then he turned back to look at Emma. The child was watching the interaction between the judge and the dog with rapt attention. Her fear was still present. Emma was far too traumatized for it to simply disappear. But it was being held in check by curiosity, by the magnetic pull of something gentle and kind, and completely different from the hostile environment that had dominated her existence for months. "Your Honor," Dr. Williams spoke up from the gallery, her professional voice carrying authority. "I would like to formally recommend that Buddy remain in the courtroom. As Emma's therapist, I believe his presence could be therapeutic and could potentially facilitate communication. Emma is in severe psychological distress. Standard courtroom procedure is exacerbating her condition rather than facilitating truth-telling." The judge turned to look at the therapist, and Emma could see him making a calculation in his mind, weighing decades of judicial tradition and procedure against the evidence of a traumatized child, beginning to respond to something gentle. She could see the conflict in his face, the internal struggle between the judge he had been trained to be and the human being he apparently still was, somewhere deep inside. "Officer," Judge Montgomery said, turning back to Officer Mitchell, "what is your professional assessment of the situation? In your experience with this dog, how would his presence affect a witness's ability to testify truthfully? Officer Mitchell considered the question carefully. Your Honor, Buddy doesn't influence the content of testimony. He doesn't suggest answers or lead witnesses. What he does is create a physiological state in which truth-telling becomes possible. Traumatized individuals often experience such extreme anxiety that their ability to access memory and language becomes compromised. Buddy reduces anxiety through his mere presence. The reduction in anxiety allows witnesses to access their actual thoughts and feelings more clearly. In that sense, his presence enhances the reliability of testimony rather than compromising it. Judge Montgomery was listening intently, his judicial mind engaging with the science and logic of the argument. Emma watched the judge's face shift again, not rejecting the idea out of hand, but genuinely considering it. It was a moment of tremendous human vulnerability, watching a man of immense authority question the foundations of his career and training. Meanwhile, Buddy had begun moving slowly toward Emma's witness chair. The movement was unhurried, giving everyone, especially Emma, time to process what was happening. The dog was not approaching aggressively or intrusively. He was moving with the slow grace of someone entering sacred space, treating the moment with the reverence it deserved. Emma's body was responding viscerally to the dog's approach. Her trembling continued, but it had taken on a different quality. It was no longer the trembling of pure terror, but something more mixed, fear, yes, but also anticipation, hope, the trembling of a child beginning to contemplate the possibility that something good might happen to her in this terrible place. As Buddy reached the witness stand and sat down beside Emma's chair, not too close, not too far, maintaining perfect distance, something shifted in the entire energy of the courtroom. The judge, still standing in the center of the floor, seemed to come to an internal conclusion. He turned to face the opposing counsel attorney. "The dog stays," he said simply. "If Dr. Williams believes his presence is therapeutic, and if the child's trauma is being exacerbated by standard procedure, then we will modify procedure to accommodate that necessity. The goal of this court is truth and justice. If this animal facilitates either of those things, he remains. Is that understood?" The opposing counsel looked like he wanted to continue objecting, but he recognized that the judge had made a decision. He nodded reluctantly. Judge Montgomery returned to his bench, but when he sat down, he did so with less of the imposing authority he had carried before. His eyes were on Emma now, watching as the small child's trembling gradually reduced as Buddy's calm presence settled beside her. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood. Something impossible was about to happen. Time seemed to stop. The entire courtroom held its breath, suspended in a moment that felt simultaneously like an eternity and a single heartbeat. Buddy's massive golden head was tilted toward Emma at a perfectly calibrated angle, not aggressive, not intimidating, but open and receptive. His intelligent brown eyes, warm and luminous, met Emma's gaze across the space that separated them. It was a moment of pure connection, a meeting of two beings, one human, one animal, who each understood on some level beyond language and logic that this was a pivotal moment in both their stories. Emma's small body seemed to be waging an internal war. Every instinct that 3 months of trauma had cultivated screamed at her to remain silent, to retreat further into the protective shell of mutism that had become her refuge from an unbearable world. But something else, something deeper, something ancient and primal, was responding to Buddy's presence in a way that transcended her conscious control. Buddy's massive form was perfectly still. The dog's training had prepared him for exactly this moment, the encounter with a traumatized child. He wasn't moving closer. He wasn't demanding anything. He was simply being present, radiating a calm acceptance that seemed to communicate directly to Emma's nervous system. "You are safe here. I am not a threat. I am a friend." Emma's right hand trembled as she extended it forward, away from her body, into the space between herself and the dog. The movement was tentative, hesitant, full of uncertainty. Her tiny fingers were shaking, not from cold, but from the overwhelming physiological cascade of emotions that was happening inside her small body. Years of trauma, months of silence, weeks of escalating anxiety about this very moment were all converging into a single instant where a child had to make a choice: retreat further into silence or reach out toward connection. Her fingers extended inch by inch, 3 inches, 4 inches, 5 inches. Buddy's tail began to move. It wasn't a frantic, excited wag that might have startled Emma back into her protective shell. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic movement, side to side, timed as if Buddy was offering her a visual representation of something peaceful and calming. The tail's movement was perfectly measured, the movement of a trained professional communicating love and acceptance through the language that a traumatized child's nervous system could understand and accept. Emma's trembling intensified as her small fingers made contact with Buddy's fur. The moment her skin touched his golden coat, something shifted, not just in Emma but in everyone present. It was as if they had all been holding their breath together, and now, in this instant of connection, everyone simultaneously exhaled. Observers in the gallery gasped softly. The court reporter's fingers froze above her stenotype machine. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen decades of human drama in courtrooms, felt tears beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. The texture of Buddy's fur was softer than Emma could have possibly imagined. It felt like silk, like clouds, like every soft thing her developing brain had ever known. The fur was warm to the touch, suggesting a living, breathing creature whose body was communicating temperature and presence directly to her nervous system. Emma's eyes widened, not in fear, but in wonder. She had never experienced anything quite like this. A being whose entire existence was communicating safety and love without words, without judgment, without expectation. Her mother, Sarah, in the gallery began to weep openly. She recognized what was happening. Her daughter, her precious Emma, was breaking through the wall of mutism that had isolated her for 92 days. She was making contact with another living being. She was reaching out. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, trying to suppress the sound of her sobs, not wanting to disturb this delicate moment. Emma's father, Robert, had straightened in his chair, his aggressive posture softening. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, relaxed. His attorney was whispering something to him, but he wasn't listening. He was watching his daughter, truly watching her for what felt like the first time in months, and he was seeing her not as a prize to be won in a custody battle, but as a person. As a small, traumatized, beautiful person who was struggling with something far bigger than her comprehension. Judge Montgomery sat on his bench, his expression transformed. The stern mask of judicial authority had been replaced by something more vulnerable, more human. He watched as Emma's small hand continued to rest on Buddy's golden fur, and he seemed to be witnessing something sacred, a moment of healing, a moment of human vulnerability breaking through the walls that legal systems construct around themselves. Buddy remained absolutely still, allowing Emma the space and time to process this moment of connection. The dog's training had prepared him for this, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful healing happens in stillness, in allowing another being to move at their own pace toward connection. He didn't lick her hand. He didn't move closer. He simply remained present, a steady anchor in a world that had become chaotic and unsafe. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened further. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in protective tension, dropped. Her jaw, which had been clenched tight, relaxed. The physical manifestations of her anxiety were visibly decreasing as her nervous system received the message that she was safe, that this being beside her held no threat, that it was possible to exist in a space without fear. Officer Mitchell watched with professional satisfaction. He had seen this happen hundreds of times in his years working with Buddy, but it never became routine. Every moment like this was sacred, a testament to the power of connection, to the possibility of healing, to the way that a trained animal could do what humans, with all their language and authority and expertise, sometimes could not. Dr. Williams, Emma's therapist, was making mental notes, already considering how she would document this moment in Emma's therapeutic record. She was witnessing a breakthrough, not just a temporary distraction from anxiety, but a genuine opening in Emma's ability to connect with another being. This was therapeutic gold, a moment that would likely become the turning point in Emma's recovery from selective mutism. Emma's hand remained on Buddy's fur for what felt like an eternity and a single moment simultaneously. She was experiencing something that her developing brain had been deprived of for months, the sensation of being safe, of being accepted, of being in the presence of a being who asked nothing of her except her presence. Buddy didn't demand that she speak. He didn't force her to choose between her parents. He didn't judge her silence. He simply accepted her, completely and unconditionally. Then, in a moment that would later be described as miraculous, Emma lifted her other small hand and pointed directly at Buddy's face. Everyone in the courtroom froze. This was it. This was the moment. Something extraordinary was about to happen. Emma's lips parted slightly. Her mouth opened. The sound of her breathing was the only noise in the entire courtroom, a soft, trembling inhalation followed by a held breath, as if her entire body was gathering courage from some deep inner reserve. Years of silence, months of isolation, weeks of mounting anxiety, all converged into this single instant. Her mother leaned forward, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father held his breath. The judge sat forward on his bench. Officer Mitchell's eyes widened with professional recognition. He had seen this pattern before, in other children, other moments. Something was about to be unleashed. Emma was about to break her silence. Buddy's tail wagged slightly faster, as if the dog somehow understood the magnitude of what was about to occur. And then, in a voice that was barely audible, a whisper so soft that the court reporter had to ask for it to be repeated, Emma spoke. Her first word in 3 months. Her first word in 92 days. Her first word since the moment her world had fractured into custody battles and impossible choices and paralyzing fear. The word that would change everything. The word came out as barely a whisper, almost inaudible in the vast courtroom space. But it was there. It was real. It shattered the 3-month silence like a stone through glass. Friend. 2 syllables, simple, powerful, everything. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale simultaneously. The word hung in the air like sacred incense, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma had spoken. After 92 days of complete silence, the traumatized 4-year-old had found her voice. Sarah let out a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but something that contained both emotions simultaneously. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears streamed down her face. Robert stood up from his chair, his body trembling with emotion. The opposing counsel attorney sat frozen, his objections suddenly seeming petty and irrelevant in the face of this human moment. But something even more remarkable was about to happen. Now that the dam had broken, the flood could not be stopped. Emma's hand remained on Buddy's fur and her mouth opened again. Words began tumbling out, slowly at first, hesitantly, but with increasing confidence. Each word seemed to unlock the next, as if her voice, having been imprisoned for so long, was desperate to finally be heard. He doesn't yell, she said, her hoarse voice growing slightly stronger with each word. The 3 months of disuse had left her voice rough and raspy, but underneath was the fundamental sound of a child finding her way back to communication. He doesn't fight, he just loves. The simplicity and truth of these statements hit everyone in the courtroom like a sledgehammer to the chest. In just a few words, Emma had captured the fundamental difference between Buddy and the adults who were supposed to be protecting her. Where the adults in her life brought conflict and fighting, This animal brought something pure and unconditional. Her mother and father both began to cry openly now, not the tears of legal strategy or custody battle, but the tears of parents realizing the damage their war had inflicted on their daughter. Emma's words came faster now, building momentum like a snowball rolling down a mountain, gathering speed and weight. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, trying to keep up. The judge leaned forward intently, listening to every word. Officer Mitchell watched with professional understanding. He had seen selective mutism break before, and he knew that once the dam broke, children often poured out everything they had been holding inside. "I didn't want to talk," Emma continued, her voice becoming clearer with each word, the raspy quality diminishing as her vocal cords re-engaged with their function. Because talking is scary. Talking means choosing, and I don't want to choose. I love mommy and daddy the same amount, the same way." These words, spoken by a 4-year-old child, seemed to cut through all the legal complexity, all the arguments about custody percentages and schedules and financial arrangements. What emerged was the simple, devastating truth that had been driving her mutism. She couldn't choose because choosing would mean betraying one parent to the other. "But they fight," Emma said, her voice now steady and clear, growing more articulate as her confidence increased. "They fight and fight and fight, and I think they're fighting about me. Are they fighting about me?" The question was so direct, so painfully honest, that several observers in the gallery gasped. Dr. Williams made a note. This was the core trauma, the fundamental wound that had driven Emma's selective mutism. The child believed that her parents' conflict was her responsibility, that she was the cause of their fighting. Her father let out a sound, a low moan of anguish and realization. He suddenly understood, in a way that no amount of therapeutic advice or legal explanation could have communicated, the damage that his custody battle had done to his daughter. Emma's words continued to flow now, becoming a torrent of revelation and feeling that had been up for months. She spoke about hearing her parents yelling late at night. She described the moment her father had shouted that he was taking her away from her mother, and how she had interpreted that as a threat, that one parent would literally steal her from the other. She talked about her recurring nightmare where both her parents stopped loving her because she had chosen wrong. "I had a nightmare," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. You both stopped loving me because I chose wrong, and I'm scared. I'm always scared that if I do the wrong thing, you'll go away." The words landed with the force of an earthquake. Both parents erupted into tears, not the controlled tears of courtroom performance, but the devastating, body-shaking sobs of adults suddenly confronted with the reality of what they had done to their child. Sarah put her face in her hands. Robert's shoulders heaved. Their attorneys, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted, stopped objecting and simply sat in stunned silence. Buddy remained perfectly still beside Emma, his presence serving as an anchor, a steady point of stability as the child emptied the reservoir of trauma and fear that had been accumulating inside her for months. "I want you both to be happy," Emma said, and these words seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 adult realizations. "But I'm scared of choosing, so I didn't talk. Because if I don't talk, maybe you'll stop fighting. Maybe you'll see that the fighting is making me sad." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Not the tense, hostile silence of a moment before, but a sacred, reverent silence. The silence of people witnessing the profound wisdom of a traumatized child, articulating what months of custody proceedings and legal arguments had failed to accomplish. Emma continued speaking, her words pouring out with increasing confidence, bolstered by Buddy's unwavering presence beside her. She spoke about her kindergarten teacher noticing she wasn't talking. She described how her friend Maya had tried to get her to play, and how she couldn't, because words seemed dangerous. She talked about her therapist, Dr. Williams, and how even though Dr. Williams was nice, the silence had been so complete that she couldn't break it. "But Buddy," Emma said, and her voice took on a tone of wonder and gratitude. Buddy didn't make me talk, he just made it okay to feel safe. And when I felt safe, my mouth opened by itself. The simplicity of this statement, that safety creates the conditions for speech, seemed to illuminate something fundamental about the entire situation. All the court orders and legal procedures and judges' authority in the world couldn't create safety for a traumatized child. But a trained therapy dog, through his mere presence and unconditional acceptance, had accomplished what nothing else could. Emma's testimony, which had started as impossible, had become unstoppable. The words kept flowing, honest and raw and devastating in their truth. She spoke about loving both her parents, about wanting to live with both of them equally, about fearing that choosing would mean being betrayed or abandoned. And through it all, Buddy remained by her side, his golden fur warm beneath her hand, his presence communicating that she was safe, that she could speak, that her truth mattered. The judge sat on his bench, tears streaming openly down his face now. This was not the trial he had planned to conduct. This was not the testimony he had anticipated, but it was the most important truth he would hear in his entire judicial career. And it had all begun with a child pointing at a dog. Emma's words had slowed somewhat now, her initial flood of speech finding a rhythm that was somehow more measured but no less devastating. The hoarseness in her voice had diminished with each sentence, as if the act of speaking was reconnecting her to her own power, revitalizing her ability to communicate. But what came next, the words that were about to emerge, would cut deeper than anything she had said before. These words would expose not just the surface trauma of the custody battle, but the existential terror that had been haunting her developing mind. "I don't talk because," she began, her voice wavering slightly, as if her body understood that she was about to speak something that had been buried in the deepest, darkest part of her psyche. Because talking means choosing." She paused, and in that pause, everyone in the courtroom could sense that something profound was about to be articulated, something that a 4-year-old should never have to carry in her consciousness. "And if I choose wrong," Emma whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of this realization, "somebody dies." The words hung in the courtroom like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Not the sound of an explosion, but the absolute silence that follows when everyone understands that something catastrophic has just been revealed. "Someone dies." Those were the words that a 4-year-old child had internalized. Those were the stakes that her developing brain had assigned to the act of choosing between her parents. In her child's logic, informed by the intensity of their fighting, by the aggression in their voices, by the threats and accusations and legal warfare, she had concluded that if she chose one parent over the other, the rejected parent would die. Or perhaps she would die. The specific logic was unclear, but the terror was absolute. The courtroom erupted in chaos, not angry chaos, but the chaos of human beings confronting something unbearably tragic. The opposing counsel attorney's face had gone completely pale. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, and began objecting loudly. "Your Honor, this is a therapist's interpretation being put into the child's mouth. This is contamination of testimony. The child is clearly being led to make these statements." But his voice sounded hollow, irrelevant, like someone trying to maintain legal procedure in the face of profound human suffering. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, not to silence the attorney, but almost mechanically, as if his hands were responding before his conscious mind had caught up to the reality of what was happening in his courtroom. "Order, order in the court." But there was no order. There could be no order. The orderly procedures of the legal system had been confronted with the raw, devastating testimony of a traumatized child, and all the gavels in the world couldn't impose order on what had just been unleashed. Emma's mother, Sarah, had actually risen from her seat and was approaching the witness stand, her entire body shaking with emotion. The bailiff moved to intercept her, but Judge Montgomery waved him away with an almost absent gesture. He was no longer thinking like a judge enforcing procedure. He was thinking like a human being witnessing tragedy. "Don't touch me! Don't touch my daughter!" Sarah cried out, though she wasn't directed at the bailiff but at some invisible force. The custody battle, the system, the abstract forces that had damaged her child so profoundly. Emma's father had buried his face completely in his hands, his shoulders heaving with massive sobs. His attorney had placed a hand on his shoulder in an attempt to comfort him, but Robert was beyond comfort. He was confronting the reality that his fighting with Emma's mother, his custody battle, his aggressive legal tactics, his attempts to win his daughter, had convinced his 4-year-old child that someone would literally die. Buddy responded to the chaos in the courtroom with remarkable instinctive wisdom. As Emma's hand remained on his fur, the dog pressed his massive golden head against the child's small leg, a gesture that somehow communicated, "I am here. The chaos is not about you. You are safe." Emma continued speaking, her words pouring out faster now, her voice becoming more urgent, as if she needed to empty every traumatic thought from her consciousness before the opportunity to speak was taken away again. "I had nightmares," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Really bad nightmares. I would dream that you," she looked toward her father, "that you yelled so loud that you got sick, and then you died, and I thought it was because I chose mommy." Robert's sobs intensified. His face, red and contorted with anguish, looked at his daughter with an expression of profound devastation. He mouthed "I'm sorry" over and over, though Emma couldn't hear the words. "And then I had another nightmare," Emma continued, "where mommy cried so much that she couldn't breathe, and she died, and I thought it was because I chose daddy." Sarah had stopped moving toward the witness stand. She stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face in torrents. The realization that her daughter had internalized the intensity of her grief and transformed it into fear of her mother's death. This was a devastation that no legal victory could compensate for. "So I didn't choose," Emma said, her voice becoming quieter but somehow more powerful. "I didn't talk, and if I didn't talk, maybe you would stop fighting. Maybe you would see that the fighting was making me sad. Maybe you would love each other again, and then nobody would die." The logic was so devastatingly clear, so painfully rational from a child's perspective, that several people in the courtroom began weeping openly. The court reporter had to pause in her transcription, overcome by the emotional weight of what she was documenting. "I thought maybe if I was really quiet," Emma continued, "you would notice that I was sad, and you would stop fighting, because you fight about me. You fight about who gets me, and if you keep fighting, somebody dies." Dr. Williams, Emma's therapist, was making notes furiously, her professional composure maintained but her hands trembling. She had suspected this. The selective mutism often masked catastrophic misunderstandings about cause and effect. But to hear a 4-year-old articulate it so clearly, to understand that her silence had been a sacrifice meant to save her parents' lives, was almost too much to bear. The judge had actually stepped down from his bench. He was standing in the well of the courtroom, no longer elevated, no longer an authority figure, but simply a human being confronting the damage that had been inflicted on a child by the very system he had spent his career serving. "This court needs a recess," he said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "Everyone except the child and her therapeutic animal will exit the courtroom immediately." "Your Honor," the opposing counsel began. "I said immediately," Judge Montgomery repeated, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was no longer speaking as a judge, but as a man who had just witnessed the devastation caused by his own legal system. As the courtroom began to empty, attorneys gathering their papers, gallery observers filing out slowly, everyone subdued and devastated. Emma remained in the witness chair, Buddy's head pressed against her leg, the golden dog's presence serving as the only stable, safe thing in a world that had been torn apart by adult conflict. The words had been spoken, the truth had been revealed, and no one in that courtroom would ever be the same. The revelation that a 4-year-old child had convinced herself that someone would die if she chose between her parents, this truth changed everything. It transformed the custody battle from a legal proceeding into a human tragedy. It revealed that the cost of litigation was being paid not by the lawyers or the judge, but by an innocent child whose mind had been twisted by conflict into believing that her choice could be fatal. And in that moment, everyone understood. The case was no longer about custody. It was about healing a deeply traumatized child. The courtroom recess had lasted exactly 42 minutes. It was the longest 42 minutes of Judge Harrison Montgomery's 43-year career in law. He had spent those 42 minutes alone in his chambers, not reviewing case law or considering legal precedent, but sitting in absolute stillness, confronting the weight of what he had witnessed. His hands trembled slightly as he held them in front of him, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether the legal system he had devoted his life to serving was actually serving justice, or whether it was simply perpetuating harm under the guise of procedure. He had made a decision. It was a decision that would likely be controversial, that might be challenged, that would certainly deviate from standard legal precedent. But he had made it nonetheless, because what he had witnessed in that courtroom had fundamentally altered his understanding of what justice meant. When Judge Montgomery re-entered the courtroom, everything had changed. The atmosphere was no longer adversarial. The opposing counsel attorney sat quietly, his aggressive posture completely dissolved. The gallery was filled with people who had been crying, observers who had been moved by Emma's testimony to such a degree that they had remained, unable to leave, their sense of witnessing something sacred overriding their ability to depart. Emma was still in the witness chair, Buddy's golden head resting against her leg. The dog had not moved during the entire recess. He had remained absolutely still, his presence a steady anchor while chaos and emotion had swirled around them. Judge Montgomery did something unprecedented, something that no one in the courtroom expected, something that would later be debated and discussed and analyzed by legal scholars and family therapists and journalists. He stepped down from his bench. He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, his black robes trailing behind him. He walked across the courtroom floor, the same floor that separated authority from the ordinary, that placed judges above and apart from everyone else. He walked toward the witness stand, toward Emma, toward Buddy. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. When the judge reached the witness stand, he did something that no judge in the history of this courthouse had ever done. He knelt down, actually physically lowered himself, bending his knees, descending to Emma's eye level. His black robes pooled around him on the marble floor. He was no longer elevated. He was no longer an authority figure looking down. He was simply a man, with a traumatized child. Sarah gasped. Robert began sobbing again, but these were different tears, tears of witnessing something transformative, something that suggested that healing might be possible. "Emma," Judge Montgomery said, his voice soft, gentle, completely unlike the stern judicial tone he had used just hours before. "I need to tell you something very important, and I want you to listen carefully because what I'm about to say is the most important thing anyone will tell you today." Emma's eyes, which had been focused on Buddy, lifted to meet the judge's gaze. In that moment, a child's eyes looked directly into the eyes of one of the most powerful legal authorities in the state. "You are not responsible for your parents' choices," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "You are not responsible for their fighting. You are not responsible for whether they love each other. And you are absolutely, completely, totally not responsible for whether anyone dies." Emma's small body seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for months. "Your job," Judge Montgomery continued, "is to be a 4-year-old girl. Your job is to play and laugh and be silly. Your job is to be loved by your parents. But your job is not to choose between them. Your job is not to fix their problems. Your job is not to carry the weight of their adult decisions." The judge reached out and gently placed his hand on top of Emma's hand, which was still resting on Buddy's fur. "You are a brave, beautiful, incredible girl," he said, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And I am so sorry that the adults in your life have made you feel like you had to be silent to protect them. That was wrong. That was our failure, not your failure." Emma began to cry, not the tears of terror she had been shedding, but tears that seemed to contain relief, recognition, the beginning of understanding that perhaps she had not been responsible for the catastrophe that had consumed her world. The judge stood up slowly, his robes falling back into place. He turned to face both parents. "I am adjourning this custody hearing," he announced, his judicial voice returning but carrying a fundamentally different meaning. "Court is adjourned, immediately." The opposing counsel attorney stood up, preparing to object, but the judge raised his hand. "And I am ordering both parents to participate in emergency mediation, not adversarial mediation, therapeutic mediation focused on the child, not on custody percentages or financial arrangements, on healing this child's trauma. This hearing will not reconvene until both parents have participated in family therapy and demonstrated a commitment to shielding Emma from parental conflict." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Furthermore, I am recommending that both parents immediately seek individual therapy to address the impact of their conflict on their daughter. I am recommending that they participate in co-parenting counseling together. And I am recommending that Emma continue working with Dr. Williams, with the understanding that her therapy is now the priority, not the custody determination." The courtroom was silent, everyone absorbing the magnitude of what was happening. The judge was not simply adjourning a hearing. He was fundamentally reorienting what the purpose of this case was. "This court recognizes that the primary victim of custody litigation is the child," Judge Montgomery said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of judicial experience suddenly being redirected. "And the primary obligation of this court is to protect that child's, not to determine who is the winning parent, not to enforce legal rights abstractly, but to protect a traumatized child and facilitate her healing." What happened next was something that would later be described by observers as miraculous. Emma's father stood up. He walked across the courtroom toward the witness stand. When he reached it, he knelt beside his daughter and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he was afraid to let her go. His body shook with profound sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair over and over. "I'm so sorry, baby, I'm so sorry." Emma wrapped her small arms around his neck, and for the first time in months, she had her father's undivided attention, not as a custody statistic, but as a parent fully present with his child. Sarah stood up and walked over as well. She knelt beside Emma and her father and wrapped both of them in an embrace. She was crying, but her tears were mixed with something else, recognition perhaps, that her fighting with Robert had caused this damage, and that healing was possible only if she stopped the fighting. In that moment, something unprecedented happened. Emma's parents looked at each other over their daughter's head, and in that moment of eye contact, the first moment of genuine, non-hostile eye contact they had shared in months, something shifted. Emma's father reached out and gently touched Sarah's cheek. The gesture was not romantic. It was not a reconciliation between spouses. It was something more fundamental, recognition of shared responsibility, shared grief, and shared determination to protect their daughter. "We have to stop," Robert said quietly. "We have to stop the fighting, not for us, for her." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "I know, I'm so sorry. I was so angry and I made it about winning and it cost her everything." They both turned their attention back to Emma, who was still nestled between them, Buddy's golden head pressing against them all, the dog serving as the final element of this moment of family reconciliation. The courtroom observers sat in stunned silence. They had come expecting a legal battle. They had witnessed instead a fundamental transformation of human consciousness. They had seen a judge step down from his authority to reach human truth. They had seen parents recognize their damage and commit to healing. They had seen a traumatized child find her voice, and in doing so, give voice to the deepest truth about what family conflict actually costs. Dr. Williams, watching from the gallery, was making final notes in her documentation. She understood that she had just witnessed the precise moment when healing had become possible, when a child's truth, facilitated by a trained therapy animal, had accomplished what no amount of legal procedure ever could. Judge Montgomery returned to his bench. He sat silently, observing the family beginning their journey toward healing. He made a mental note to use this case, with appropriate confidentiality protections, as the foundation for a new judicial approach to family law, an approach that prioritized healing over winning, that recognized the human cost of litigation, that understood that justice meant protecting children, not just distributing parental rights. As Emma, her parents, and Buddy sat together in the center of that vast courtroom, everyone understood that something impossible had occurred. And it all began when a 4-year-old girl pointed at a dog. 3 months had passed since that extraordinary day in Judge Montgomery's courtroom. 3 months of healing. 3 months of genuine transformation. 3 months of watching a traumatized child slowly reclaim her life. Emma sat on a sun-dappled grass in her grandmother's backyard, her small frame radiant with joy and freedom. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind of unself-conscious, pure laughter that had been absent from her life for so long that it felt like a miracle each time it emerged. Beside her, Buddy moved with the same grace and gentle purpose that had characterized every interaction since that first moment in the courtroom. The dog's golden fur gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and Emma's small hand rested comfortably on his head as they played together. Her selective mutism had completely dissolved, not through force or medical intervention, but through the simple, profound power of feeling safe. Emma spoke freely now, sometimes in the rambling, enthusiastic way of children, sometimes in the thoughtful, careful way of someone who had learned to value her own voice. Her speech patterns had normalized completely, the hoarseness from 3 months of disuse long since faded away. More importantly, Emma had become a different child. The weight that had been pressing down on her, the sense that she carried responsibility for her parents' happiness, that her choices could be fatal, that she needed to disappear to protect the people she loved, had lifted. She played freely. She expressed her feelings. She no longer monitored every interaction with the obsessive vigilance of a child trying to prevent catastrophe. Her parents were still separated legally, still navigating co-parenting, still working through their own individual healing and therapy. But the fighting had stopped. Completely. When Emma was with her father, she experienced a parent who was fully present, engaged, and completely committed to shielding her from adult conflict. When Emma was with her mother, she experienced the same dedication to her, the same commitment to healing. Both parents had made significant changes. Sarah had reduced her working hours to allow more time with Emma and to focus on her own therapy. Robert had moved to a smaller house closer to Emma's school, making it easier for both parents to be involved in daily life. They had both participated in co-parenting counseling and had developed genuine, respectful communication about Emma's needs. There was no winner. There was no loser. There was only 2 parents united in the understanding that their daughters was the only thing that mattered. Dr. Williams' office wall now held a framed photograph. Emma, her parents, and Buddy, all together, all smiling, taken on the day of their first successful family therapy session post-courtroom. The photograph represented everything that therapeutic healing could accomplish. But the impact of that day in Judge Montgomery's courtroom rippled far beyond Emma's personal story. Within a week of the hearing, the courthouse had received over 1,200 requests for Buddy's services in other cases. Judge Montgomery's decision to allow a therapy dog in a sensitive custody proceeding had sparked a national conversation about trauma-informed justice. Legal scholars began publishing papers analyzing the case. Family therapists cited Emma's testimony in trainings across the country. News outlets called her the girl who taught the world about listening. The Pennsylvania state legislature, moved by Judge Montgomery's recommendations, began drafting legislation to fund therapy animal programs in courthouses nationwide. The bill was titled the Emma Justice Act, named after the 4-year-old, whose silence had spoken louder than any words could have. The legislation created funding for certified therapy animals in family courts, mandated trauma-informed training for judges hearing custody cases, and established protocols for therapeutic mediation focused on child rather than parental rights. Judge Montgomery himself became an unexpected advocate for judicial reform. He began traveling to other courthouses, speaking about the dangers of adversarial family law and the necessity of trauma-informed approaches. His decades of experience, his authority as a senior judge, gave weight to his arguments in a way that academic research alone could never have accomplished. He recommended that custody hearings never include child testimony unless absolutely necessary, and that when child testimony was required, it be facilitated through therapeutic support rather than traditional adversarial questioning. The American Bar Association created a new division dedicated to healing-centered family law, and Judge Montgomery was appointed as the inaugural chair. The mission of this division was to fundamentally restructure how courts approached family law, prioritizing healing over winning, recognizing the human cost of litigation, and understanding that true justice in family cases meant protecting children. Buddy himself became something of a celebrity. Officer James Mitchell received requests for the dog services from courthouses across the nation. A documentary team approached him about creating a film about Buddy's work and Emma's case. Universities began establishing certification programs for therapy animals specifically trained for courtroom work. Buddy became the prototype for a new generation of canine professionals dedicated to facilitating healing in legal proceedings. The courthouse where the hearing had taken place created a new courtroom specifically designed for sensitive cases involving children. It was called the Safe Space Courtroom, and it incorporated elements specifically designed to reduce the intimidation and fear that traditional courtrooms create. The judge's bench was lowered. The lighting was warmer. There was space for therapy animals. The courtroom was painted in calming colors. The entire architectural design communicated, "This is a place where your humanity matters more than legal procedure." Emma's case became mandatory study material in law schools across the country. Law professors used the case to teach future lawyers about the psychological impact of custody battles on children. Medical schools incorporated Emma's story into trauma education programs. Psychology departments used the case as an example of how healing requires creating safety before truth-telling becomes possible. Family therapists cited Emma's testimony in research about selective mutism. Her case became a landmark example of how trauma-informed approaches could facilitate recovery from elective mutism more effectively than traditional therapeutic techniques. Dr. Williams published a groundbreaking paper titled, "When Silence Speaks: Trauma-Informed Approaches to Selective Mutism in Children of High-Conflict Custody Disputes." But perhaps most importantly, Emma's story sparked a cultural conversation about the true cost of custody litigation. Parents began reconsidering adversarial approaches to custody. They began asking, "Is winning custody worth damaging my child? Am I willing to compromise my child's mental health to win in court? What does it mean to truly protect my child in a custody situation?" The number of families pursuing adversarial custody battle decreased significantly in the years following Emma's case. More families opted for mediation and collaborative law approaches. The understanding that children are the true victims of custody litigation began to shift legal culture in fundamental ways. 5 years after the courtroom hearing, Emma, now 9 years old, began volunteering with therapy animals in her free time. She had been inspired by her experience with Buddy to dedicate her life to helping other traumatized children. She worked with Officer Mitchell and Buddy in courtrooms, comforting children who were experiencing similar trauma. In a profound full-circle moment, Emma had transformed from being a victim of the system into being an advocate for other children struggling with similar circumstances. Her parents, now in different relationships, maintained their commitment to co-parenting with respect and kindness. They had both done the deep work of understanding how their conflict had damaged Emma, and they had both committed to never repeating those patterns. They served as speakers at conferences on healthy co-parenting, sharing their story and the lessons they had learned about prioritizing children's over parental rights. Judge Montgomery, approaching the end of his judicial career, made family law reform his legacy. The approaches he pioneered spread to courthouses across the nation. Young judges studied his methods. Law schools taught his philosophy. The entire landscape of how courts approach family cases began to shift, becoming more healing-centered, more trauma-informed, more focused on protecting children. But none of it would have happened without that moment in the courtroom when a 4-year-old girl, trembling with fear, pointed at a golden retriever and spoke her first word in 92 days. Friend. That single word, spoken in a voice barely louder than a whisper, had rippled across the nation. It had changed courthouses, changed laws, changed how people understood the impact of custody litigation. It had transformed a judge from an enforcer of procedure into a guardian of human. It had awakened parents to the true cost of their fighting. It had demonstrated the power of connection, compassion, and unconditional acceptance to heal what seemed irreparably broken. Buddy, the golden retriever with the infinite patience and the supernatural ability to communicate safety, had become a legend. But he remained humble, unchanged by his fame, still showing up at courthouses, still placing his golden head against frightened children, still facilitating the healing that helped broken families begin their journey toward wholeness. And Emma, the girl whose silence had spoken louder than any words, had grown into a teenager, and then a young woman committed to helping other children find their voices. She wrote a memoir about her experience, titled When I Learned to Speak, which became required reading in schools across the country. In the memoir, she described the moment she met Buddy, the moment her fear transformed into trust, the moment she understood that it was possible to feel safe in a world that had become terrifying. The impact of that single day continued to unfold years and decades later. Courts became more compassionate, judges became more human, lawyers became more focused on healing, parents became more committed to protecting their children. Children, hundreds of children, thousands of children, found their voices through the legacy of what Emma had started. And it all began with a pointed finger and a whispered word. Friend. One word, one moment, one child's courage to break her silence. Changed everything.